as it were, we were close friends. I mean, we were friends because of other people.
It began with a confession no one expected, spoken in a moment of weakness by the man the monarchy had spent years trying to bury. Within hours, Meghan learned she had become the gravitational center of a scandal she never touched. And by nightfall, King Charles had already chosen the one action that would shake the family to its core. The whisper that broke the silence. It began on a cold December morning when the sky hung low over Windsor, pressing itself against the rooftops like an omen the city was too tired to interpret. Winter had settled early that year, carrying with it a kind of metallic quiet that amplified every rumor, every whisper, every tremor inside the palace walls. The staff moved more cautiously than usual, their steps softened by instinct rather than instruction, as though they sensed that something deep within the institution was shifting. Nothing had been confirmed yet. Nothing had even been explained, but a murmur had leaked outward from a single source, and by the time senior advisors reached their desks, the whisper had already begun carving its own shape across the kingdom. The trouble started with a remark uttered not from a podium nor through an official channel, but from the dim interior of a temporary residence where Andrew Mountbatten Windsor spent most of his days in restless frustration. The comment was not meant for the public. It was not even meant for the palace. It was spoken in a moment of fatigue, resentment, and emotional unraveling, offered to an aide who had served him for more than 20 years and who had never before betrayed his confidence. Yet the words were too volatile to contain. They slipped from that room into another, and then another, until by late afternoon the confession had become a quiet wildfire moving through the palace with unsettling speed. Meghan learned of it far later than the rest. In California, where the sky was still dusk purple, she received a call close to midnight from a discreet advisor who had grown accustomed to speaking softly whenever the subject matter involved royal affairs. The advisor did not explain everything. They did not have the authority to do so. Instead, they said something that made Meghan sit upright in bed, her hand instinctively pressing against her heart. "Something is moving. You need to be aware." Those words alone carried the weight of past battles, the kind that had nearly crushed her spirit and reshaped her life. She listened carefully, but the advisor spoke in fragments, unable to give full context because full context had not yet been understood. Across the Atlantic, senior officials had already entered crisis posture. The call sheets from earlier that day showed a troubling pattern of inquiries from journalists who rarely reached out without cause. A producer from a major British network had contacted the palace press office, asking whether there was any truth to the rumor that Andrew had recently referred to Meghan in a conversation about his own downfall. A veteran correspondent from a well-known American morning show had requested comment on allegations that a new narrative involving Meghan might be emerging from within the royal household. The palace refused to respond, but inside the walls of Buckingham the alarm had begun to take shape. By early evening, a preliminary briefing circulated among the inner circle. It contained a single sentence that chilled the air in the room. Andrew told an aide that Meghan is not innocent either. No explanation, no context, no evidence, just an insinuation flung into the world by a man who no longer held power, relevance, or credibility, yet who still possessed a destructive potential history had repeatedly underestimated. The ambiguity of his remark made it all the more perilous. Innocent of what? That was the question already spreading through digital channels where speculation thrived in the absence of truth. Inside the palace, advisors gathered in the smaller conference room near the private apartments, each carrying a folder marked with early analysis. Though the details remained sparse, the advisors understood immediately that the implication alone could trigger a fresh cycle of misinformation. Just 2 weeks earlier, the monarchy had barely contained a surge of fabricated narratives that tied Meghan to Andrew through manipulated images and artificially generated timelines. The comment he had made, even unintentionally, risked validating the very stories the palace had spent days dismantling. It was as if Andrew had reached through the smoldering ashes of scandal and breathed life into a fire that had not fully died. Meghan, meanwhile, paced in the dim light of her living room, the phone still warm in her hand. Harry stood nearby, arms crossed, his jaw clenched with a familiar tension he no longer bothered to hide. He asked the same question over and over. What exactly did he say? But no one could give a precise answer. The advisor told them only that it involved Meghan by implication, that Andrew had spoken in a tone described as bitter and detached, and that the palace was still determining the extent of the damage. Meghan felt her stomach tighten. She had left that world. She had detached herself from titles, duties, and ceremonial obligations. Yet here she was once again, drawn back into chaos through a sentence spoken by a man she barely knew. As night deepened over London, the palace came to an unspoken conclusion. This would not fade quietly. Andrew had said something. It had reached the wrong ears. And whether intentional or accidental, the consequence was the same. The monarchy was once again approaching a precipice where silence could be mistaken for complicity. Word by word, hour by hour, the whisper began transforming into a shadow that threatened both Meghan's peace and the institution's fragile stability. And though no one yet understood the full scope of Andrew's confession, one truth had already settled like frost upon the palace windows. A storm was forming, and the monarchy had only just begun to feel the wind. Inside the confession. The truth of what had transpired inside Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's reduced quarters 2 days earlier did not emerge all at once. It seeped slowly through accounts offered by shaken staff, pieced together like fragments from a room where the air itself had grown too heavy to carry sound properly. It was the afternoon of December 2nd, a day marked by low clouds and a thin drizzle that beaded along the windows of the small residence he had been occupying since leaving Royal Lodge in late autumn. The space, once intended as temporary, had begun to feel permanent in the way disappointments often do when they overstay their welcome. The atmosphere in the room matched his mood: dim, tight, stripped of ceremony. Only the echoes of a life once overflowing with privilege remained, clinging to the corners like dust. Andrew had been pacing since morning. One aide later recalled that he moved with the restless energy of a man who could no longer distinguish anger from sorrow. His fall had been public, humiliating, and unrelenting, and the weight of that disgrace pressed against him with every passing week. Once he had been surrounded by staff, advisors, and protectors who buffered him from consequence. Now fewer than a handful remained, and even they navigated his presence with the caution of people tending to a volatile flame. He spoke rarely in full sentences. Instead, his words spilled out in bursts, clipped and jagged, as if he feared that completing a thought might force him to confront it. By early afternoon, an advisor attempted to gently steer him toward a discussion about ongoing restrictions, a conversation that had been postponed repeatedly because of his fluctuating temperament. This time, something snapped. He lowered himself into the worn armchair by the window and stared through the glass at the blurred outline of leafless trees. His breathing was unsteady, shallow, the kind of breathing that comes after hours of internal argument. Then, without warning, he said a line that brought the room to stillness. "They act as though I was the only one who made mistakes, as if she were innocent in all this." He did not speak Meghan's name, but the staff knew precisely whom he meant. His tone was not accusatory in the classic sense. It carried instead a strange mixture of bitterness and self-pity, the sound of a man rewriting the story of his own collapse to avoid looking directly at it. The aide closest to him insisted later that the remark was not shouted nor repeated. It came out low, almost reflective, but loaded with a dangerous ambiguity. Innocent of what, though he never clarified, the implication hung in the air like smoke in a sealed room. It was the kind of sentence that meant nothing and everything at once. a vague suggestion that could be weaponized by anyone hungry for scandal. The advisor tried to redirect the conversation, but Andrew waved a hand dismissively, muttering that the palace had allowed others to escape scrutiny while he endured the full force of public outrage. His voice wavered between self-righteousness and despair. It was painfully clear that he saw himself as a victim, not of his own decisions, but of selective punishment. As the conversation deteriorated, the aide excused themselves briefly, stepping into the hallway to compose their thoughts. That was when the gravity of the moment settled in. Andrew's remark had not been an explicit accusation, yet in the current climate, where conspiracy channels churned content by the hour and viewers over 50 shared manipulated images with unshaken conviction, even a suggestion from him could ignite an inferno. Barely a fortnight earlier, palace analysts had dismantled a digitally fabricated narrative that placed Meghan in Andrew's orbit years before she met Harry. The rumor had spread with disturbing efficiency, propelled by synchronized accounts and artificially enhanced photos. And now, through his careless remark, Andrew had breathed oxygen into its dying embers. The aide returned to the room, hoping the moment had passed, but Andrew remained locked in the same spiraling monologue. He insisted that the public had been misled about the complexity of the past. He implied that people outside his circle had enjoyed the benefit of doubt he had been denied. His voice cracked more than once. It was not rage. It was not clarity. It was something far more difficult. A collapse of boundaries between truth, ego, and desperation. When he finally fell silent, the aide quietly ended the visit and stepped outside into the damp air, their mind racing through the implications of the words they had just heard. What happened next followed the predictable choreography of palace communication. The aide spoke in confidence to a senior staff member, not out of disloyalty but out of duty. A remark of that nature, however ambiguous, could not remain unreported. Within hours, the information had reached the upper levels of the communications office, and from there moved discreetly toward those responsible for safeguarding the monarchy's reputation. No one panicked. Not yet. But everyone understood the potential for catastrophe. If that sentence escaped its intended boundary, it could merge seamlessly with the misinformation ecosystem already waiting for any seed, however distorted, to flourish into a full-blown narrative. Inside the palace, several advisors stayed late that night reviewing the aide's account. They tried to interpret the intention behind Andrew's words. Was he insinuating something he had given no details, offered no timeline, named no interactions? In fact, by his own history, he had never occupied the same social or professional spaces as Meghan during the years being scrutinized online. Yet the absence of specifics made the remark even more dangerous, because a vacuum attracts speculation in the same way darkness attracts fear. And when speculation meets resentment, the result is rarely contained. By the time senior officials reconvened the following morning, the conclusion was unavoidable. Andrew had spoken out of bitterness, but the interpretation of his bitterness had already escaped his control. His confession was not a confession in truth, but it was enough to suggest to the outside world that Meghan's name could be drawn into his downfall. That alone made it a crisis, and as the palace braced for what might come next, there was an unspoken recognition that this moment would force choices few had been prepared to make. The monarchy had weathered storms before, but this one carried a strange new shape. It began with a wounded man speaking into a dim room, and now it threatened to push the institution toward yet another reckoning. And somewhere far from Windsor, Meghan herself had no idea how profoundly those words were about to alter the days ahead. Meghan learns the truth. Meghan first sensed something was wrong long before she knew what had happened. It was late evening in Montecito, the kind of quiet California night where the air cools just enough to make the world feel briefly weightless. She was finishing a call unrelated to anything royal, When her second phone buzzed with a notification reserved only for messages from a particular advisor in the United Kingdom, she hesitated before answering. The last time that number appeared at such an hour, the conversation that followed had reshaped months of her life. When she finally picked up, the voice on the other end did not begin with a greeting. Instead, it carried the tentative softness reserved for delivering unwelcome news. "We have a situation developing. You need to be aware." Meghan froze, one hand pressed lightly against her temple. The advisor spoke carefully, as though every word risked triggering an emotional collapse. They explained that a remark made by Andrew Mountbatten Windsor had circulated within Buckingham Palace. The details were not yet fully known, but early interpretations suggested that he had made a comment that indirectly implicated her in matters tied to his past. They stressed that no accusation had been made outright. His words had been vague, almost muttered, but the implication had been enough to set off alarms. Meghan felt her heartbeat rise steadily, climbing into that familiar, unwelcome rhythm she had come to associate with the monarchy's gravitational pull, one she thought she had escaped. Harry entered the room when he heard her tone shift. He approached quietly at first, then immediately stiffened when he recognized the expression on her face. He had seen that expression too many times before, each one connected to a tidal wave of headlines, speculation, and unrelenting intrusion. Meghan put the call on speaker, and as the advisor repeated the fragmented information, Harry paced, running a hand through his hair before stopping abruptly. His reaction was not subtle. It was sharp, visceral, born from years of watching the consequences of silence devour their lives. He demanded details the advisor did not have. When did Andrew say this? What exactly were his words? Who overheard it? How far had it spread? The advisor offered what little they knew. The remark had been reported internally earlier that day. Senior officials were meeting. No decision had been made about public action. The only certainty was that the palace feared the comment might breathe life into a rumor they had recently spent weeks dismantling. Meghan closed her eyes, feeling the weight of that statement settle upon her shoulders. So once again, she thought, I am dragged into a narrative I never touched. It was not anger she felt at first. It was exhaustion, thick and consuming, the kind that seeps into the bones and makes even the act of standing feel burdensome. After the call ended, silence filled the room, broken only by the faint hum of the heater. Harry knelt in front of her, taking both of her hands in his. He was furious, though he tried to temper it for her sake. He had walked away from that family to protect her, to shield her from harm, to give their children a life untouched by the slow-moving machinery of royal politics. And yet here they were, once again discussing a crisis triggered by a man neither of them had invited into their lives. Meghan whispered that she did not understand how Andrew even felt entitled to speak her name in any context. Harry responded that it did not matter what Andrew believed or intended. What mattered was how the palace chose to respond. The problem was that she knew the palace far too well. She knew its instinct for caution, for silence, for waiting until the temperature rose high enough to force a reaction. She had lived through the consequences of that silence. It had nearly broken her once, and now the idea that the institution might allow Andrew's remark to linger unchallenged terrified her. Because in the world of digital media, a rumor left unattended becomes a myth, and a myth becomes history. She had learned that lesson painfully, and she feared that this time the damage could be even greater. Her phone buzzed again. A message from the advisor read, "We are seeing movement online already. Manipulated images, old timelines resurfacing." The sentence made her stomach twist. Her name had always been an easy target, a headline magnet, a character in someone else's script. Now it seemed Andrew's careless words had aligned perfectly with the digital machinery waiting to weaponize them. Within minutes, Harry opened his laptop and scanned the early chatter. There it was. Accounts posting side-by-side comparisons of photographs altered by artificial intelligence. threads suggesting connections that never existed, commentators theorizing about Meghan's presence at events she had never attended. It felt surreal, almost dreamlike, to watch the narrative assemble itself in real time, the pieces snapping into place with terrifying efficiency. Meghan pressed a hand to her chest, struggling to steady her breath. She whispered the question that had been forming slowly in her mind. Why am I still paying for a family I no longer belong to? Harry looked at her with a mixture of sorrow and helpless rage. He wanted to say that she was not paying for them, that none of this was her responsibility, but the words would not have been true. She was paying, once again, for proximity, for public memory, for the shadow of an institution that refused to release its hold. As the hours passed, Meghan sat near the window, staring out into the soft glow of the California night. She felt the familiar ache of a life split between continents, between past and present, between who she had been expected to be and who she truly was. And though she tried to calm her thoughts, she understood something with painful clarity. Andrew's remark, however insignificant it may have seemed in his dimly lit room, had become the spark for a much larger storm, the kind of storm that always found her, no matter how far she ran. The palace splits behind closed doors. By the morning of December 3rd, Buckingham Palace carried the unmistakable heaviness of a building bracing for impact. The corridors were unusually quiet, as though everyone inside sensed that any sudden movement might disturb a delicate balance already straining under its own weight. Senior advisors had been summoned early, their faces set in the kind of controlled neutrality reserved for moments when the monarchy confronted not ceremony, but crisis. As they entered the small conference room near the private apartments, each carried a folder containing the preliminary analysis of Andrew's remark and its potential aftershocks. The room itself felt colder than usual, despite the radiators humming faintly along the walls. Charles entered last, his posture straight but his eyes shadowed with fatigue. He took his seat at the head of the polished table, and for a long moment no one spoke. The unspoken truth hung between them. A single careless comment had revived a narrative that the palace had fought to extinguish only weeks earlier. Now it threatened to mutate into something far more corrosive. Anne was the first to break the silence. Her voice, sharp and unembellished, cut through the tension as she stated plainly that Andrew's words could not be ignored. The remark was ambiguous, she said, but the public interpretation would not be. In the digital age, ambiguity was a weapon. William sat opposite her, his expression calm but unmistakably tense. He leaned forward, fingers interlocked, and explained that social media channels in both the United Kingdom and the United States had already begun circulating distorted interpretations of Andrew's muttered line. According to the palace digital analysts, several accounts with histories of manufacturing anti-Meghan narratives had mobilized within hours. They were stitching together old content, recycled theories, and artificially enhanced images to present a renewed storyline. William's voice remained level, but the urgency beneath it was unmistakable. If we do not intervene now, he said, the narrative will harden, and once it hardens, no correction will fully dislodge it. Camilla, seated to Charles's right, exhaled slowly before speaking. Her tone held a steadiness that came from decades of navigating public scrutiny, rebuilding her public image brick by careful brick. She reminded the room that the monarchy's handling of Andrew had been based on fact, on documented evidence, on moral necessity. To allow Meghan, a woman not connected to any of Andrew's past decisions, to be dragged into that world would not only be wrong, but also profoundly damaging to the credibility of the institution. The line we drew, she said, was clear. If the public begins to believe there were shadows behind that line, then our previous actions lose their moral grounding. Several advisors exchanged glances. They knew she was right. They also knew the path forward was complicated. A formal statement would draw global attention, fueling speculation in the short term. Silence, however, would imply acceptance or indifference. The monarchy had relied for generations on a strategy of selective restraint, believing that time dissolved rumors more effectively than rebuttal. But the world had changed, and they all knew it. In an era where misinformation spread faster than any official correction, time was no longer an ally. It was a spark that could ignite a fire. Charles listened without interrupting. His expression revealed little, but his hands remained clasped tightly before him. He understood better than anyone that they were approaching another threshold, another moment where the old rules no longer applied. He finally asked whether Andrew had clarified his remark. The answer came from a senior aide who had spoken directly with those present during the conversation. No clarification had been offered. Andrew's tone had been bitter, his meaning opaque. He had neither elaborated nor retracted. He had simply allowed the words to hang in the room before shifting into grievances about his own treatment. The discussion afterward grew more heated. One advisor urged caution, arguing that a public statement could embolden Andrew's supporters to spin the situation further. Another insisted that silence would allow conspiracy channels to define the narrative entirely. Anne leaned back in her chair, her jaw set. She had no patience for the debate. "We disciplined Andrew because of facts," she said. "Facts, not speculation. If we allow speculation to rewrite that truth, then what was the point of any of it?" William agreed, though his reasoning differed. He explained that the demographic spreading the rumor most aggressively was the same demographic most loyal to royal content. If they believed Andrew's implication had merit, they would not simply share the narrative. They would absorb it, and once they absorbed it, it would become part of the unofficial history that no palace statement could unwind. Charles pressed both palms against the table. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low but decisive. "We cannot let Meghan become collateral damage for Andrew's unraveling." The room fell silent again, this time with a sense of direction rather than confusion. The king's words were not emotional. They were strategic, moral, and deeply aware of the cost of ignoring what was unfolding. A second meeting followed that afternoon, this time with legal advisors who outlined the potential ramifications of failing to act. If Meghan chose to pursue legal action against the palace for negligence, the situation could escalate into an international spectacle. If the palace acted swiftly and publicly, however, it could halt the spread before it crystallized into an enduring myth. By the time evening settled over London, the palace had made an unspoken shift from debate to preparation. Drafts of potential statements were circulated. The communications office prepared talking points for senior members should journalists press for comment. And behind every decision lay a growing recognition that this crisis was not simply about a remark or a rumor. It was about the monarchy's ability to define truth in an age where truth was becoming optional. As the lights dimmed in the smaller conference room and staff began to disperse, Charles remained seated, staring at the documents before him. He knew that the next steps would shape not only public perception, but the internal integrity of the family itself. And although no final decision had been declared, the direction was unmistakable. A line had been crossed, and now the monarchy would be forced to respond. The investigation and the decision. By the early hours of December 4th, the palace had already shifted into a mode that those within its walls referred to quietly as containment posture. It was not dramatic, it was not chaotic, it was clinical. A series of precise actions executed with the urgency of people who understood that reputational damage did not wait for sunrise. The digital analysis team had been working through the night in a room illuminated only by the glow of their monitors. Reports lay scattered across the long table, each one outlining how Andrew's murmur, a sentence not meant for air, had already begun resonating across online spaces that thrived on distortion. The first document Charles received that morning detailed the timeline of the rumor's reawakening. From the moment Andrew's remark was reported internally, analysts noted a spike in cross-platform references to Meghan. Some appeared organic, but several showed patterns of coordination. Multiple accounts posted the same altered photo within minutes of each other, each accompanied by slightly different captions suggesting a vague but dangerous connection. Another cluster revived old conspiracy threads, rewriting their narratives to appear newly supported by Andrew's supposed implication. It was not proof of orchestration, but it carried the unmistakable fingerprints of users who had mastered the art of turning ambiguity into accusation. William entered the briefing room shortly after 7:30, his expression sharpened by a night with little sleep. He absorbed the information quickly, moving through the reports with the speed of someone who had learned to read digital crises as fluently as others read newspaper headlines. When he reached the section detailing the demographic breakdown, he paused. Once again, the highest engagement came from viewers over 50 in the United States and the United Kingdom, a group particularly vulnerable to visually convincing misinformation. William tapped the page lightly before setting it aside. "We have a narrow window before this becomes irreversible," he said. "If we hesitate, we surrender control of the narrative. And once it is gone, it will not return." Legal advisors arrived next, bringing with them a perspective the palace could not afford to ignore. If the monarchy remained silent while Andrew's remark fueled defamatory content, Meghan could argue that the institution had failed in its duty of care, especially given the recent history of online harassment. One advisor placed a memo on the table with a single sentence highlighted in yellow. Inaction may be interpreted as tacit approval. Charles read it twice, feeling the weight of every word. It was a phrase with both legal and moral implications, one that forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth that silence, the monarchy's long-standing shield, had become a liability. Anne arrived shortly after, her stride brisk, her jaw set in the familiar expression of someone unmoved by sentiment. She did not sit immediately. Instead, she stood behind her chair, scanning the documents spread across the table before speaking. "This is manufactured," she said, her voice steady, "and if we allow it to grow, we undermine every decision we made regarding Andrew. We acted then because of evidence. We must act now because there is none." Her point struck directly at the heart of the matter. The monarchy had spent years untangling truth from the wreckage of Andrew's past. To allow speculation to retroactively blur that line would be to jeopardize not only Meghan's reputation, but the institution's integrity. Camilla, who had been quiet until then, finally spoke with a softness that disguised the severity of her conviction. "The palace cannot permit Andrew's disgrace to spill into someone else's life. It is wrong, it is harmful, and it turns victims of circumstance into victims of design." She reminded the room that Meghan had suffered deeply under the weight of public hostility, and that allowing even a whisper of false association would be cruel and indefensible. Charles listened. Closely, his face unreadable, but those who knew him well recognized the subtle shift in his posture. He was beginning to lean toward action. The investigation continued throughout the morning, revealing an even more troubling detail. Several of the accounts amplifying the rumor had posted content related to Andrew weeks earlier, as if waiting for a spark. The analysts could not prove coordination, but the timing was too precise to dismiss. That discovery solidified what many in the room already feared. This was not merely a rumor. It was a structure designed to be activated, and Andrew's careless remark had become the trigger. The decision Charles faced was not simple. A public statement would draw scrutiny and revive the story in global media cycles. It would place Meghan's name alongside Andrew's in official print, something no king would do lightly. But failing to respond would allow the distortion to metastasize, rewriting reality one misinterpreted sentence at a time. He stood slowly, taking a moment to steady his thoughts before speaking. Prepare language. It must be firm, factual, and final. Silence settled over the room. Not relief, not victory, something heavier. The recognition that a line had been crossed and now needed to be redrawn. William nodded, already envisioning the structure of the statement. Anne closed her folder with a quiet snap, signaling her agreement. Camilla touched Charles's arm gently, offering support without words. By midday, drafts began circulating. Each version emphasized 3 points. Meghan was not connected to Andrew's past. His remark was made during a period of personal instability, and any suggestion otherwise was entirely false. Charles read the final draft in his study, the winter light filtering faintly through the curtains. He signed it with deliberate care, knowing the impact it would carry. It was the second serious action he had taken against his brother in recent months. But this one, unlike the last, was not about punishing Andrew. It was about protecting the truth, and protecting the woman who had already been burned too many times by the shadows of a family she no longer called her own. The statement that changed everything. The winter sun had already begun its slow descent behind the thick London clouds when the palace prepared for the announcement that would ripple across 2 continents. By late afternoon on December 4th, the press office had become a hive of tightly controlled movement. Phones rang with the rhythm of crisis. Assistants hurried between offices with last-minute confirmations. And beyond the palace gates, reporters pressed closer, sensing the shift in the air even before the first official word was spoken. Something significant was coming. Something the monarchy had not attempted in years. Inside the palace, King Charles stood beside the long table in the communications room, reading the finalized statement for the 5th time. He read with the precision of a man who knew that every syllable mattered. The weight of recent days lingered in the lines of his face, but beneath the fatigue was a resolve that had not been present earlier in the week. He understood what the decision represented. It was not merely a response to a rumor, it was a declaration of boundaries, a reassertion of truth, and a reminder that even in an age drowning in manipulated narratives, the monarchy still possessed a voice capable of piercing the noise. At precisely 4:15, a senior press secretary stepped out onto the stone path leading toward the assembled journalists. No fanfare accompanied her, no staged backdrop or editorial flourish. She held only a single page embossed with the royal crest. Cameras clicked rapidly as she began reading aloud, her voice steady against the sharp bite of the cold. The opening line cut through the icy air with unmistakable clarity. Buckingham Palace acknowledges the circulation of fabricated allegations relating to the Duchess of Sussex and Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. The word fabricated delivered the first blow, removing any ambiguity, stripping the rumor of its oxygen. The statement continued, detailing that after review by internal and external advisors, no evidence had been found to support claims of any private, personal, or historical connection between Meghan and Andrew. This was the second blow, and in many ways the most powerful one. The monarchy rarely named individuals so directly, especially when addressing controversy. Yet here, the king was placing Meghan's name alongside Andrew's only to separate them with surgical precision. The palace was drawing an unmistakable boundary, as though carving through the layers of deceit that had formed online. The third line delivered what some commentators would later call the sentence that froze the narrative. Any suggestion linking the Duchess of Sussex to matters related to Mr. Mountbatten Windsor's legal history is entirely false. Entirely false. Not unsubstantiated, not unlikely, not unverified, entirely false. The phrase moved through news studios with the velocity of breaking weather alerts. In the United States, morning shows interrupted their segments. In Britain, networks flashed banners across screens while analysts scrambled to update their commentary. Even those who had long criticized Meghan found themselves momentarily stunned by the firmness of the palace's language. But behind the public revelation, a quieter drama unfolded in private rooms. Meghan received the statement at her home in California minutes before it was released globally. She sat beside Harry on the sofa as her phone chimed with the alert. As she read the words, she felt her breath catch. She read them again, slower this time, letting the clarity sink into the places that had been bruised by fear and disbelief. Relief washed over her, but it was a fragile relief, the kind that does not erase the wound, but acknowledges the salve. Harry watched her carefully, a mixture of gratitude and caution in his eyes. He knew the statement was necessary. He also knew that it did not undo the emotional toll of the last 48 hours. Across the ocean, Andrew received a very different message. A senior aide delivered the reprimand personally, placing the envelope on the table before him with a solemn expression. The king had chosen his words carefully, addressing the incident with the measured firmness expected of a monarch whose patience had been tested beyond measure. Andrew read the contents without speaking, but those present later described a man shrinking further into the isolation he had created. The reprimand did not remove additional titles. There were none left to take. Instead, it removed the last thread of plausible influence. It was a boundary he could no longer push against. Inside Buckingham Palace, the hours following the release felt strangely still. Staff members walked with a subdued calm, aware that something irreversible had taken place. The monarchy had stepped into a new era of communication, one where truth could not rely on silence or tradition. It required articulation, it required precision, and it required the willingness to confront a storm before it consumed the narrative entirely. Charles remained in his study long after the statement had circulated around the world. He did not speak. He simply rested his hands on the polished desk, staring at the documents that had been the catalyst for the last 2 days of turmoil. He knew the decision would trigger criticism. Some would say he acted too strongly. Others would say not strongly enough. But he also knew this. The monarchy had faced a threat not from scandal itself, but from the distortion of truth. And by acting decisively, he had prevented the line between reality and fabrication from eroding further. It was not victory he felt. It was responsibility, and the quiet, unavoidable acknowledgement that the days ahead would demand even more of it. By the end of that week, London moved on, at least on the surface. The Christmas lights flickered along the streets. The markets swelled with visitors. Children pressed their mittened hands against windows filled with ornaments and chocolate displays. But inside Buckingham Palace, the air carried the faint aftershock of what had nearly spiraled into a crisis beyond control. Staff walked with a renewed awareness of how fragile the monarchy's narrative had become in a world capable of rewriting truth with a few clicks. Meghan felt the shift too, though from a vast ocean away. The statement had protected her. It had drawn a line where none existed before. But it also reminded her that she remained, unwillingly, tethered to a family whose shadows could still reach across borders and years. She did not cry when she read it again that evening. Instead, she felt a quiet steadiness settle inside her, a reminder that she had survived worse, and that survival itself had become a kind of armor. Andrew disappeared once more into the silence of his diminished life. The reprimand marked the closing of one door and the slamming of another. His world had grown smaller. His influence had thinned to almost nothing. And in his study, Charles understood the truth that would follow him into the new year. He had acted not out of tradition, but necessity. He had protected the truth before the lie became permanent. In the end, that was all a modern monarch could do: stand between the crown and the chaos, and hope the line holds.